If I was to ask the question, how do you view Ireland's native wildlife? The answer you would give would depend on a number of factors. As a nation, we have an affection for all things wild, but viewpoints vary. For some, our native wildlife without question is something to be cherished, respected, and given the utmost protection. For others, their view is of a passing interest. For yet others, their view about Ireland's native wildlife is influenced by the effect it has on their livelihoods. Wildlife, in this instance, is seen as a threat and as something that should be managed or even eradicated. But what about wildlife that has been introduced to our country either consciously or inadvertently? Do we have a united view that something needs to be done to make sure that these alien invaders are kept in check and not allowed to flourish at the expense of our native plant and animal species? In this programme, I want to understand the significance of what is the impact introduced species have on Ireland's environment. Over the course of this programme, I visit 3 areas to talk to individuals and experts and to see what communities, county councils and national parks are doing about the challenges posed by Ireland's alien invaders.
Well, this feels like an absolute jungle. I mean, these are just giants. These are another invasive species. These are called gunnera, giant rhubarbs. And the significance of this is that everywhere we go in Ireland, there seems to be invasives all over the place. And I've just walked from the gunnera behind me there, and now I'm in a place with Japanese knotweed, but it's all dead. And that's because it was treated last year by injection. It's very close to a river here, so you've got to be environmentally aware. You don't want to be putting chemicals into the river courses here. And that's what's happened. They've injected every single plant in this stand and it's all died. But the reality is that with Japanese knotweed, for instance, it takes many years, 3 to 5 years, to completely eradicate. So there will be a continuing program here, because already we have this year's growth, and that will have to be injected once we get to August and September.
In dealing with the control or eradication of invasive species, proper care and consideration needs to be given to the methods employed. Some methods, including for instance the control of deer species, can be very divisive. Others, such as the control of invasive aquatic shellfish, require practical steps. Yet others, including the chemical eradication of Japanese knotweed, while effective, is not necessarily good for the immediate environment requiring treatment. Are there other ways? I travelled to South Kerry along Ireland's Wild Atlantic Way to a beautiful village called Caherdaniel, where a community information session organised by local woman Barbara Hild was being held. At the seminar, I met with Jane Jackson from the Kerry Japanese Knotweed Survey and Awareness Project. Jane, this is a typical stand of knotweed. Yeah. So I wasn't really aware of what a stand was, but a stand is a congregation of plants, I guess.
That's right, yeah. And what you can see here, particularly in the river, it's most likely come down river, it's been washed down river, it's flooded up here, you've got the stands up here.
Ah, okay.
And you can see it's right up here. It's obviously been treated somewhere there by somebody where the dead wood is there. This is the problem with the rivers, because if the rivers keep moving, they keep spreading it, and there's no end to it unless you actually have to eradicate it if you want to control it.
So the rivers, in effect, each time a river floods, for instance, it's going to wash soil, it's going to wash
it breaks off
all
these knots you see here. That's where they can regenerate. And underground, because the soil is very loose near the river, it breaks off the underground rhizome. It's a woody thing, it's very brittle, breaks it off, and that will survive anything.
Like, what are the problems with Japanese knotweed? Why should we tackle this? It's not just biodiversity, is it?
Well, that's the main thing now,
Okay.
because it outcompetes absolutely every plant that we have. There's no plant in this country that can compete with Japanese knotweed. So you end up with a mono culture. So you don't just lose the biodiversity of plants, you lose the biodiversity of insects, and then you're losing the biodiversity of birds, because it doesn't even produce seeds to feed the birds. We only have the female in the country. So there's nothing. I mean, it provides very little for our ecosystem.
So biodiversity is in fact quite a big reason to try and tackle this. That's what you're
Huge
saying.
reason, yeah, absolutely. It takes up more and more, especially on rivers which would be rich in biodiversity normally. And if the rivers then, as I say, in the Lown River, I mean, they're losing the biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking here of insect populations, for instance, and of course, what feeds on insects? Salmon, trout,
Exactly.
sea trout.
Everything, yeah.
So it really is.
And the bees need the pollen early in the season to build up their populations.
Yeah.
There's no pollen. No pollen until August. I mean,
That's
what use is
something
that to anyone?
That's actually something I've noticed, that ahead of nearly everything else, you can start to see the Japanese knotweed from as early as maybe February, March, and it grows quite vigorously even at that stage.
A foot
all
a
of
week,
the small
like this much every week.
wildflowers are literally just not obliterate, but the canopy, that the shade.
Yeah,
that actually
nothing
this
can grow.
provides,
Yeah,
nothing
nothing will grow
there's
under
nothing
it.
photosynthesizing underneath it.
Yeah,
Okay, that's really
exactly.
interesting. So if Japanese knotweed has the ability to outcompete other wildflower species and in turn lead to a reduction in overall biodiversity along our river courses, then something must be done. But environmental reasons alone are sometimes not enough for action to be taken. Japanese knotweed is a real threat to buildings and new developments and can be very costly to remove. It is this combination of habitat and biodiversity loss, coupled with economics, that drives the elimination of some of our invasive species. Another threat to our native wildlife, and in particular to our nesting ground species, is the American mink. The mink we see today probably descended from escapees from mink farms established in Ireland in the 1950s and 60s. These animals, which are related to otters, stoats and pine martens, spread rapidly throughout the island of Ireland. They kill and eat waterfowl, eggs, hatchlings, other ground nesting birds and fish. My next stop is to visit field ecologist Dr. David McCormack of the Irish Wildlife Trust. David is an expert in the value of wetlands for biodiversity and conservation, and is based at the Tralee Bay Wetlands Centre. At the centre, he runs field ecology education for students. Tralee Bay and its wetlands are part of Europe's Natura 2000, the largest coordinated network of protected areas in the world. It offers a haven to Ireland's most valuable and threatened species and habitats. I mean, your work with the Irish Wildlife Trust, for instance, you initially looked after the Kerry branch of that.
Yeah, which is still very active here.
Yes, that's right. And you go on field trips.
Yeah, and we run, I mean, it's mostly public information stuff that we do. So it's taking people on walks, so we take them up to the mountains, up to the bogs. We might take them basking shark watching or whale watching, so it's a whole
so
spectrum.
There's a nice
Yeah, but I mean, a
across.
lot of stuff we do. I mean, the Wildlife Trust, they have a great initiative called the Badger Club, which is particularly aimed at young kids. So we do bug hunts with kids and all sorts of stuff like that as well. So
The actual wetlands itself, there's lots of invertebrates, and they in turn produce, flying insects, and then that's what these birds eat.
Absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
it's not just the birds eating them. I suppose the invertebrate that would be kind of synonymous with wetlands would be dragonflies, of course.
Oh yeah, because I've seen some of them flying around.
And,
Some
I
of them
mean,
get very
it's
big.
been a brilliant couple of years for dragonflies, but I mean, some of those guys, would be bigger than birds.
Yeah.
And they're all feeding on those little flies as well. So those little midgies that everyone hates so much. Without them, nothing would exist out there.
So,
They're super important,
you come down here if you don't want to be eaten alive by midges because
everything else is eating them.
sorted out.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. I mean, it's so important because you're based here, because you kind of see at first hand how things can change the environment, the local environment, local habitats. You've also got involved in some work in relation to invasive species, for instance.
Yeah, so I mean, as an island nation, I suppose this is probably one of the biggest threats that are facing our biodiversity. So an invasive species is a plant or an animal from another country or another part of the world that is brought in either accidentally or on purpose. And within our ecosystem then it's acting outside the constraints that it may have operated on somewhere else. You know, something might have, in the case of a plant, something might have been eating it. In the case of an animal, something might have been hunting it or keeping it in check, or climate. So suddenly in Ireland it's free from those constraints, so it can get out of control.
So it can actually alter, if you like,
hugely, and it knocks our own ecosystem then out of balance. I used to have a pair of hooper swans here. I mean, they aren't wild birds, they were captive bred, but Hansel and Gretel were their names. Anyway, poor old Hansel met his demise at the hands of a mink. So speaking of invasive species, it's a huge issue in Ireland now. I mean, they were introduced initially into the 60s in Ireland for the fur farming industry, and for various reasons. You know, obviously, you know, personally I would be very against fur farming just in general. I think it's a horribly cruel industry. Yes. But you know, a lot of those places were closed down, and sadly they were often closed down by people who meant well, and but the animals were released or broke. You know, they were let go into the wild, or often if the farms closed, cages were just opened and they were released. Okay. So you've got it's a member of the mustelid family. You know, the same as the stoats. Superb predators. You know, brilliantly adapted for hunting. They swim really well, and all of a sudden they're in a landscape here where they're not constrained, and no natural predators have mink in Ireland in the same way that they would in America. You know, they'd have, you know, eagles and wolves and all that kind of stuff. So nothing here. Right. You know, it's lovely and mild. They can remain active the year round, and they're just having an absolute field day, particularly with our waterfowl.
Okay, so essentially what they're doing is they're predating on nests, they're predating on young chicks,
adult birds
as well.
Quite indiscriminate. I mean, anyone who farms will tell you that they all have stories of mink attacking very young lambs, very young calves, you know, while they're resting. So
so these are vicious.
They're superb predators. I mean, you can't help but admire the animal, but they're just they're in the wrong place.
So then you have to try and actually keep them out of here.
Yeah, I mean,
that must be difficult.
It's impossible. Is what it's proved to be. I mean, you're looking at a situation now in Ireland where you're looking at trying to control mink numbers in the breeding season around sensitive areas. Because there are more mink now, I think, by the last, you know, and obviously it's hard to get accurate numbers, but the last figure I saw was about 40,000, which would be more than the otters we have here now. Wow. So they're here to stay, so we've just got to try and adapt.
I'm here in the heart of County Kerry, Killarney National Park, and I'd like to meet and talk to Peter O'Toole, National Parks and Wildlife Service Ranger. And he's an expert in an introduced species of deer called sika. And I want to find out from him what is the conflict in the context of this deer and the regeneration of the woodlands here in Killarney National Park.
First sika deer introduced into Ireland were introduced by Lord Powerscourt in 1860. If you like, one of the introductions from Powerscourt was into the Muckross estate here, into the Herbert estate in Muckross, and there was one stag and 2 hinds introduced. And from that small beginnings, it was reckoned, or not estimated I would say, but more of a guesstimate in the 1960s, 1970s, that there was maybe 1,000 to 1,500 sika deer in the Killarney Valley area, mostly within the confines of what we now call the National Park. I suppose they were the foundation of what is now, you know, something like a 20,000 plus population countrywide of sika deer. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, they are, I mean, if they're not controlled like any deer species, they will spiral out of control very quickly, and we see that with both red and sika here. If you don't control the population, you know, you're going to face major problems, like with road accidents, that kind of thing, and the more deer you have, the more likely it is for an accident to happen. And then again, they're having a major impact on woodlands as well, preventing woodlands, like in the park here, our native woodlands are in big trouble. They're not regenerating because of an overpopulation of deer, and Sika kind of added hugely to that equation, you know what I mean, when they were introduced. Now that they're at a large number, like the red deer. When we had the red deer only, I mean, you could deal with that, but now you have a double whammy with the Sika involved as well, and the Sika are more secretive and they're more difficult to control, a much smaller deer than the red deer, so they have caused problems, there's no doubt about it. Apart from excluding them with wire fencing, your only other method really is to shoot, Right. And shooting really, I know people are horrified when they hear, shooting those beautiful Bambi-like animals and all that, but shooting is a very effective way to reduce, large wild animal populations like deer, and it's done all over the world. It's found to be the most effective way, I mean, fencing is fine, but it's only a very temporary measure, because fencing posts will they'll rot after so many years, and a branch of a tree can fall in the fence, then deer get in and they undo all the work that nature has done over the past maybe 10, 15 years within the fenced area. So fencing, we have found over the years, is not the answer really. It's only a short-term solution. Controlling the numbers is the most important part of the whole thing. You have to kind of estimate a density of deer per hectare or whatever and reduce your population down to that level.
The most important thing for the national park obviously is its biodiversity, and you're taking everything into consideration here. You're taking everything from bryophytes to ferns, to wildflowers, to saplings, to mature trees. That probably takes precedent in the context of making sure that that's preserved for future generations
And
to enjoy.
Deer then are almost a very destructive element in all that, and people look at deer, they see deer, they're very kind of a conspicuous animal, they're a large animal, but they don't see all of the other, when you talk about biodiversity, all of the other animals and plants that are affected by overgrazing, overbrowsing of woodlands. People, as I say, are emotive about the deer issue, but they should see the larger picture, and they should consider all the other plants and animals as well that are almost absent from most of our woodlands at this stage because of the overpopulations of deer and the effect they're having on the whole ecosystem, if you like.
As you can see, the whole area of how to deal with invasive species is a difficult one. Thankfully, by getting people to openly discuss and express opinions, new and innovative solutions can be found. In this regard, I spoke to Niall Hogan of the Derrynane Clinic. Niall is a plant scientist and practicing medical herbalist. Here, he shares his knowledge of Japanese knotweed and gives us insights into its use.
I mean, it's such a vigorous grower, but I suppose from a herbal point of view, it has a huge range of different herbal actions. It's highly antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral in particular. So in certain circles, it will be one of the primary plants that's used in the treatment of Lyme disease, which is something that's a little bit more topical. It's a bit more topical in recent years from tick bites. It has a very strong action on the immune system. It's very strongly immunomodulant, so in some instances it can upregulate the immune system, and in other instances it can downregulate.
Oh, so basically you can switch it up, you can switch it down.
It tends to do that depending on the individual and what's required.
And is this just from, let's say, the leaves of the plant or the stems, or does it have different properties?
It has a lot of properties. It's got a lot of plant constituents. There's one in particular called resveratrol, which is quite widely known and sold in supplement form. A lot of that supplement is actually ground up knotweed root, or the resveratrol has been extracted from knotweed. Has a lot of benefits for heart health, cardioprotective. It's also shown to have benefits for possibly protecting the brain against the development of beta amyloid plaques, which is a factor in Alzheimer's. From a bacterial infection point of view, from a Lyme disease perspective, and also some of the co-infections that come with that, it has got very strong neuroprotective properties. both for the brain and for the central nervous system.
From a solution perspective, you see a completely different use for this. I mean, is it cultivated for these purposes?
It is certainly harvested and cultivated in its native environment in Asia. It would be eaten as a food source as well. I mean, the young shoots, when they're kind of maybe 4 or 5 inches out of the ground, look quite similar to asparagus, and are eaten and prepared in a very similar manner to
They're
asparagus.
actually eaten.
Yeah.
They're eaten.
Yeah.
Right. So as a food source.
As a food source, as a very nutritious food source. Yeah, they're quite strong, and I suppose that's the thing when you vegetatively harvest. My thinking as a plant scientist before I became a herbalist would be that over a period of time you will eventually starve the rootstock and the rhizome system of its stored up food source, because if you're continually cutting the vegetative aerial parts, it can't photosynthesize, so it can't, as it goes through like late summer into early autumn, that's when it's really powering a lot of its food down into the root source to overwinter.
Yes.
But if you're starving that off by topping it, you will over a period of time. It's a 3 to 5 year period of time. It's not a short, there's no short way to treat this.
But it's a management of sorts, I guess.
But it is a management of sorts, and then the other benefit of doing that is that if you're taking the vegetative tops off and appropriately disposing of them, you're opening up the ground to sunlight, which will allow a lot of the native plant life to then germinate and grow and compete for space on the ground.
Kind of like a rewilding, I suppose, of the natural species.
Well, letting it do what it normally wants to do. I mean, the seed and the rootstock and the rhizomes of the native plants are always there, and you'll find that when knotweed is removed, the native flora returns.
I really have learnt a lot on my journey to uncover the truth behind Ireland's invasive species, and I found out, for instance, that not all species are a threat really to the environment, but the ones that are, for instance, Japanese knotweed, taking over our riverbanks and not allowing our wildflowers to grow. We really need innovative solutions in terms of how to address those. It's not just by using chemicals, for instance. There are other ways, for instance, that open my eyes, that you can eat it, that you can use it maybe for medicinal purposes. And then we look at mink. They really are well established now in the Irish environment, but they do have a devastating effect on waterfowl, particularly because they take their eggs and young chicks from nests. And sika deer, a wonderful looking species, but they do have a devastating effect on forest regeneration. So they eat saplings, and something will have to be done in that context to control them. These species don't have a top predator, so they have to be controlled in some way. Excluding them from areas is one way, but of course, you see, they've spread all over the place now, so they're turning up in other woodlands as well. And if, as in the case in Killarney National Park here, if you clear the forest floor, you're opening it up to other invasive species like rhododendron, and that is a big, big problem. So we really do need to control some of our invasive species.
Coming up next week. Every year, our mountainsides are decimated by wildfires. Is this necessary?